the presentation gave me the impression that you consider the issue of restrictions on religious freedoms and the attendant ills that they cause as a problem across the board, worldwide, whereas that's really not the case, in that if you consider the severity of the problem is concentrated in two sets of countries. One is certain Muslim majority countries, and the other is communist or former communist countries like Cuba, North Korea, Vietnam, and so on. And in large regions of the world, the problem either is non-existent, like South and Central America, even Mexico. This is much attenuated. North America and Europe, I mean, you do have the restrictions on the hijab in France due to the secularist nature of the state and so on, but that's really quite minimal compared to the severity of the problem elsewhere. So I wonder whether, in a way, by trying to, perhaps you're trying to avoid essentializing Islam as the source of the problem, but whether that does not create some distortions in the analysis. Thank you.
Terrific question. Tim, you want to, or Peter, well, either one of you.
Okay. Yeah, it's a good point. It's true there are different levels of restrictions on religion. Right, so the Americas are tend to be the lowest. Sub-Saharan Africa, pretty low as well. That's not to say that it's not a problem, or that wouldn't be a problem if restrictions were implemented. So, in Venezuela, there's been issues with Chavez kind of taking a hostile stand towards some Catholic priests that are against him. In Sri Lanka, which is, non-Muslim country, there's been a lot of issues with restrictions, minority rights. And so the Pew data found this all over. Some of my research has also looked at, voting on blasphemy laws. And it tends to be, it's not just Muslim states, not just certain region. It's whenever there are higher restrictions on religion, we see some of these negative effects. I think it's true that they're lower in some places, but it's worth, watching and keeping an eye on.
Well, and I think it's also important to point out that the Pew data show and the Jonathan Fox data show. Jonathan Fox has done a systematic analysis of this, by the way, and I urge you to look at his work, the most recent work, where he controls for religious tradition and so forth. And yes, he does find some regions with certain religious traditions do have more severe problems. But at the same time, he's found that the negative trend, is across the board. It isn't restricted. But I take your point, and we tried to emphasize that there's an argument to be made that the prevalence of government favoritism towards religion, which is highly correlated with certain kinds of social hostilities involving religion, is a bigger problem in what could be called the Muslim world and in many other regions of the world. There's no question about it, and the report that USCIRF produced highlights that. So we don't want to be naive that this is somehow an issue that equally affects all regions. It certainly does not, and you're absolutely right to point that out.
If I could just add to those answers to that very important question. Clearly there are distinctions. The numbers show that. But the trends in Europe are very troubling. And what we have there is an aggressive secularism. So that if you look at the Pew Research Center data, you'll find the extraordinary fact that in the high and very high categories of social hostilities toward religion, you'll find Saudi Arabia and Iran, countries you would expect to be there, and right next to them is the United Kingdom, which has emerged within the last several years as having very high social hostilities toward religion. Now, we're going to have, actually, there's going to be a hearing or a briefing of the Helsinki Commission on the Hill on Monday. Professor Trigg and I are going to be there to talk about Europe. So, you want to get ahead of the curve a little bit. I quite agree. We don't, people aren't being tortured and thrown into jail and killed for their religious beliefs. But when you begin to see the graph moving in this direction, I think it's important to ask why. And I would just simply say that, as I believe Katrina mentioned, maybe it was Elizabeth, the United States is not remaining still with low levels of restrictions. It's beginning to inch up. And so, this is important, and I think it's important to make the distinctions, but but to get ahead of a problem that may be developing in our own country, and certainly within the West. Okay. We have Commissioner Aziza.
The question of essentialism was raised about Islam. And I think that is, anytime you raise issues of essentialism, it requires a great deal of study. And in this particular case, I would suggest that one snapshot of history is not enough to reach that sort of conclusion. I would suggest that you go not only forward, as you had mentioned with respect to trends in other countries, but also go backward in history to see what the history of a religion is before we essentialize it. Because once we do that, we have reified a whole group of people and their ways of thinking, and we've made it much easier then to discriminate against them.
At the Religious Freedom Project, I have banned the use of the word essentialize and reify. So we don't do that.
That's right.
Thank you. A very important point.